We're delighted to see those of you who joined us last time and those of you who are here for the first time. This is a Section 9 meeting, Psychoanalysis for Social Responsibility, Part 2 of Tour to Social Psychoanalysis. And like last time, our focus is going to be mostly on the toward. And with your questions in mind, thanks to Jessica Chavez for everything, for setting this up, and for her fabulous Padlet, where people have been posting questions. So thank you, and thanks to Steve Knobloch, also Education and Training co-chair with Jessica. So I'm going to start, as I did last time, and as I always do, with a land acknowledgement. I am on unceded Massachusetts land in Brookline, Massachusetts, and I start with a land acknowledgement, which, as I said last time, has become increasingly important to me, coming out of my work in a reparations campaign, where we understand a commitment to truth-telling as the first step toward repair. And having read many things, including Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz's Indigenous Peoples' History of the United States, and recently watching Jan Hawkins' newer film, it's just a rough cut at the moment, her series of films on Native American resistance, climate change resistance. You can see how, like with the afterlives of slavery, treaties continue to be broken by the government's collusion with fossil fuel industry, and land is continued to be taken, and also the extractive relationship to the land continues with now some really amazing resistance to that Jan's been chronicling. I also want to give my social location, and that feels also increasingly important to me, and I keep understanding more as I give talks and go to talks why it's important. For example, someone last week was talking about how she opened a class. There was a racial enactment going on in her class, and she had assumed, as it turns out incorrectly, that there was only one person of color in the class. And that was not the case. Someone else identified as a person of color and was harmed by the whole conversation. So, I feel like it's important at the outset. You know, obviously, we're not conscious of every piece of our identities, and but these are the categories that I've taken up a lived intersectional relationship to. I'm cisgender, white, nominally heterosexual, and Jewish. And I in an early iteration of a meeting about my book, I forgot to mention that. And I'm now learning in a training that I'm doing with a left-wing young Jewish group, that I need to do more work on understanding the intersections of my Jewishness and my whiteness and our whole history. So also I want to say before we start that we're going to be attending today closely to the power dynamics in the discussion, and encouraging people from positionalities of power to speak, but to hold your questions, to make space for BIPOC participants, and also for graduate students and people who generally don't get a chance to speak in these kind of forums. So I'm going to start with just giving some highlights from the last meeting, and then I'll introduce Marianna, who will do the same, and Lara, who will do the same, and then we move to your questions. Again, I'm learning every time I do a program or teach my book, which I've been doing a lot this month. I get more insight into actually what I'm doing. And I think the way I would say now what I'm doing is that I am trying to understand how we unconsciously reproduce particular versions of subjectivity, and particularly versions that are rooted in cultural inequalities. Many people have their own versions of social psychoanalysis, many actually who are in Section 9. But I am trying part of how I've been trying to elaborate my own view of social psychoanalysis is to bring in academic theories of how the outside, how ideologies, institutional structures, systemic inequalities get inside, and vice versa, and how they get back outside. And particularly, I focus on how we might be colluding in the clinic with reproducing well, this is part of the tort. It's not continuous in the book, but with reproducing a white, middle-class, individualistic subject. So I think crucial for the toward is what's white and upper class about our theories and our practices. And there's several articles just recently coming out. Yesterday we had an amazing program with Michelle Stevens at my institute that spoke to that. In my work, I'm indebted to many post-Marxist theories and feminist theories, especially intersectionality theory, that focuses on the overlapping oppressions of race, gender, class, and sexuality. And that's what helped me, that and thinking about enactments that I saw happening in the clinic, that I read about happening in the clinic, enabled me to develop the concept of normative unconscious processes. That's pretty central to, it's totally central to part 2 of the book, but kind of central to the whole book. And as we talked about last time, normative unconscious processes evolve from cultural forces that mandate splitting off of certain ways of being, feeling, and acting, depending on where you are socially located, and what you come to think that you have to do to inhabit a so-called proper identity that's going to receive social approval. And for that, I am indebted to Erich Fromm in terms of the motivation. However, I also speak of resistances to these processes, some of which are also unconscious and some conscious. So the model I'm developing, more than I would say Fromm's model, is one of a dynamic unconscious, with conflict being central. And as for the clinic, what I've done is taken a lot of principles of relational theory, particularly that there are 2 unconsciouses in a room at all times, and that unconscious enactment is inevitable. Take that from Edgar Levinson. And that if analyzed rather than repeated, these can be potentially curative. And then finally, the 3rd section of the book, and several papers as you get closer in each section to the present, they're chronologically ordered. I have a heavy focus on the psychic effects of neoliberalism, which is the current form of racial capitalism in the United States. And that also led me to look more deeply into character, from Fromm's idea of social character, which was pretty like over inclusive, I would say, of a whole culture. And then that led to people picking that idea up and talking about a culture of narcissism, where narcissistic personality was the central, thought about as the central social character. But I tried to make a more nuanced analysis of character by drawing on feminist and cultural studies conceptions of the interrelationship of different subcultures to each other within a culture, differently positioned, differently raced, classed, and sexed, which lead to different kinds of dynamics in the clinic, and including things you can think of as normative transferences and countertransferences. So I'm positing that there's different ways that different groups are encouraged to split off ways of being. For example, dependency, autonomy, like how does that happen in particular subgroups, like white, male, upper class, and different ways of experiencing emotions like shame, fear, ways of loving. And also really important in my work is how our the wounds that we've experienced, the collective wounds that we've experienced, say from sexism or racism, can become engaged with the other and stir up the wounds of the other. So some of the papers speak to that. So in terms of neoliberalism, it's interesting. One of the classes I was teaching, and I may have mentioned this last time, there was a student who was born in 1985, and she asked, you know, for her it was this, she said, well, how is it different before? And because I'm so old, I actually have experience pre-neoliberalism that I could speak to. But I think what she brought home to me is how the question that Fromm asked, actually, that analysts, therapists have to challenge the pathology of normalcy. These things feel normal to us, but they're really not. And for that, you often have to do some reading outside of our field. But you really have to get to know what, you know, the Gramscian Marxist Stuart Hall talked about as the current, really understand the current conjuncture. And right now, since we've last met, we see a continuing, deeply disturbing confluence of white supremacy and free market fundamentalism that I think we need to attend to. So that, I'm going to leave it there, and we'll answer questions after that, and after Marianna and Lara speak. So I'm going to pass it over to Marianna.
Great. Thank you, Lynn. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We were really excited by the enthusiasm and the energy of the last gathering, and really wanted to make this space to bring everyone back together to talk more. And so I will just do a very quick recap of some things. But before I get into that, just to introduce myself, my name is Marianna. I am speaking to you from occupied land, which was stolen by white colonists from the Massachusetts people. It is now referred to as Cambridge, Massachusetts. I identify as a white cisgender woman, able-bodied, born in Massachusetts, upper middle class from a politically left family. I'm of Greek, Eastern European Jewish, and Anglo-colonist descent. So what I want to do here, just really briefly, I think, you know, in my work sort of helping Lynn to bring together the articles for the book, a lot of what we talked about were sort of like, what are the core themes of a social psychoanalysis, as Lynn is describing it throughout the book. And so we developed a list, and, you know, when I frame it as a list, that implies a certain static nature, which I want to get away from, because truly these principles are dynamic, they're fluid, they're contextually driven. So holding that as I go through this list, I hope folks can do. And also just to note that Lara in her work does a really incredible job describing the principles of an anti-oppressive psychoanalysis. And there's obviously tremendous overlap here. And so I know she'll be speaking more to that very shortly. So at its core, a social psychoanalysis, you know, as it is articulated in the book, and I think lived and practiced and breathed, is an anti-racist theory and practice. It's anti-capitalist. It engages in an intersectional analysis of subjectivity and relationality with a focus on power relations. And I just want to name her for folks who were here last time. This may be a bit of a repeat, but again, I think it's useful just for setting the frame, and for new folks just to hear it once more. Again, at its core, a social psychoanalysis is about context and history, and our efforts to become aware of how both synchronous and diachronous social relations are being enacted by both the patient and therapist. It focuses on work that goes beyond 1 or 2 generations, where we often find our focus quite limited, interrogating what ghosts and ancestors are in the room, and how are each person's ghosts and ancestors in turn interacting with one another or among each other. Social psychoanalysis is about, in this sort of framing of it, is about being conscious of the field's tendency to reproduce sovereign subjects, hearing what is being said as pointing beyond the individual and into the social systems in which we all live. It's about interrogating the normativity of theories and practices, as Lynn has been describing. How are these theories and practices reproducing heteronormativity, white supremacy, economic oppression, and how are these normative processes unconsciously then reproduced in ourselves, our clinical dyads, and our institutions? So it's a multi-tiered examination in this sense. It's about understanding that our culture demands a destruction of the links between the psychic and the social, which is all too evident in a normative psychoanalysis, and understanding the gravitational pull in white people to continuously recenter themselves, and to continuously, and so the principle in this case is to continuously be resisting that recentering. When we think about what divides the self, this is about understanding that social forces are at work at all times in our inner conflicts in some shape or form. Grounding, it's grounded in a relational psychoanalysis because of the ways that a relational psychoanalysis does honor vulnerability and interdependence, but that this also carries major shortcomings. And an ethic of disillusionment, which is a stance, particularly for people in positions of power, that requires a continual effort to maintain, rather than lapse into complacency, to maintain the decision to always be choosing to see the abuses of power around us. Because we know that not seeing is a choice, whether a conscious choice or an unconscious choice, but a choice. And embedded in all of this, this is about rebelling against the impossible expectation that clinicians treat social problems as individual problems with individual solutions. So that's a framework essentially for what Lynne gets into in the book and in her work. And here I want to pass it over to Lara.
Thank you. And can I have you take over the admitting folks? I think there's still folks coming in. All right. مرحبا وأهلا وسهلا بالجميع. أنا اسمي لارا الشيحة. My name is Lara Shihai, or Shiha, which is the correct way of saying it in Arabic. And welcome everybody. So happy to see you again. So I have truncated what I'm going to say because some of you have already been here, and we're really excited about the conversation, and that's really the heart of all of this. And there's so much energy around this now. I know there has been for quite some time from a lot of folks, but for those of us from marginalized spaces to come into a space and be like, wow, we can fucking finally have this conversation, and I'm not the odd one out and I'm not alienated, feels a little bit exciting. So we're gonna jump right into that. But I do want to name that part of, I'm a person of color, and I will locate myself more specifically later. But part of this is to make clear that I am, this relationship with Marianna and Lynne is a relationship that is ongoing and forged in trust on an ongoing basis. And the reason why I say that is because I think sometimes there's an assumption on the part of white folks that these conversations can always happen, and that either there's a necessity for those of us who are marginalized to have this conversation, or that there's a way in which they set the tone of that. And I don't think that's the case. I think we are beyond dialogue at this point. And so when I locate myself, I locate that this is a conversation and a trusting relationship that's been going on for ages, and that we actively do this. We're actively in conversation around what this looks like, what our positionality looks like, and some of the hard parts of that when we hit up against certain walls. And I'm focusing on the toward because that's a lot of what my work is about. So this is what I will be saying. So to me, a commitment to social psychoanalysis is a commitment to anti-oppressive work. And I'll be a little bit more specific about the difference between anti-oppressive work and decoloniality. There's a very specific reason why I don't often use decoloniality, because to me, decoloniality means land back, right? It's a land back movement. And I'm not sure that a lot of folks are sort of ready to say, this is what I'm committed to, but anti-oppression is one of many things within a decolonial framework. So that's why the framework of anti-oppressive process is really important. And this means action and theory, action, and praxis. The commitment, of course, is not performative or abstract, and not an abuse of theory, which psychoanalysis really has the tendency to do. We have all the right words and all of the right theories, and then there's an abuse of it because it's fundamentally, we seed nothing structurally. We talk the talk, but we really don't do anything in terms of seeding structural issues. This is what Marianna mentioned in the points, is a sort of what I would say a reorientation to the reality principle. And when I say reality principle, I mean material reality, right? Fundamental truths, fundamental historical truths that can't be compromised. In its most simple starting point, one part of that is locating oneself. Marianna referred to it as contextualization, right? Doing that, to me, is a commitment to not disavow. This can mean different things, but as I said, most importantly includes a land acknowledgement, and that the land acknowledgement connects to land back movements, which Tuck and Yang have told us decolonization is not a metaphor. There's only one thing that decolonization means, and it means land back efforts, right? And what that means in a settler colonial state like the United States. So I'm coming to you from occupied Pamunkey land. It's technically ceded, but let's be honest about settler colonial history. Nothing is non-coercive. And so for me, it's occupied land. I'm a cisgender, queer, able-bodied Arab woman, specifically Lebanese, which means something in the context of the Arab world too, that relationality. I'm a post 9/11 immigrant to the United States and I hold green card status. I'm not a full citizen of the United States. This naming process is not secondary or pedantic or in any way, but rather a political act of recognition. And I would say there's an emphasis on political. Oftentimes these conversations become defanged from the politicized nature that they should have. And what I would say when I say act of recognition, it is not a recognition of the white gaze or the settler gaze. I've slowly forged this as I'm seizing myself and my act of recognition for myself from white supremacist violence, right? Again, not forged through dialogue with the oppressor, but rather because in my opinion, dialogue always leaves us, right? Those of us who are marginalized as already having been compromised. So this is not a matter of waiting for somebody to bestow recognition upon us. So it's saying we are seizing back the process. And this act of recognition in locating myself is one of political recognition. The land acknowledgement, again, for me specifically, being in what is now called Williamsburg, is important because the United States is a settler colonial state. And I locate myself here, Pamunkey land, 2 miles from Jamestown settlement and 2 miles away from William and Mary, which was built by stolen and enslaved peoples. This becomes especially important now. It's always been important and folks have been doing this for ages. And like many things, psychoanalysis is catching up. I'm happy we are, but folks have been doing this for ages and Indigenous folks have taught us this and Black folks have taught us this. But right now, against the backdrop of a global onslaught of fascism marked by hyper-ethno-nationalism and anti-immigrant rhetoric. So here we see how land acknowledgement in the context of settler colonial states is super important. And when I say settler colonial states, I'm referring to what is now known as the United States, what is now known as Canada, what is now known as New Zealand, what is now known as Australia, and what is now known as Israel. It'll always be important to have a land acknowledgement because there's no way to locate oneself without recognizing the settler colonial violence that is ongoing. And the perpetual violence, right, in the context of the United States, a settler colonial state that then also used enslaved Black bodies to perpetuate its futurity, right? There's no way to locate ourselves without also mentioning that, and no way to locate ourselves within psychoanalysis without mentioning that. Anti-oppressive work for me within psychoanalysis includes non-negotiable truths of history, right? And this is where sort of Lynne had spoken about normative unconscious processes forcing a split. What I would say is that this is where the split is necessary, right? Don't be afraid of the split because splitting and saying, no, there are non-negotiable material realities, to me, splitting forfeits its pathology, right? It's not pathological anymore when marginalized folks are saying, no, this is material history and this is not an issue of perspective. This is not an issue of relationality. And this is not an issue of working out, forging a space. This is material reality and historical reality. We can see the abuses of how that's used, right? To sort of situate oneself and claim innocence, right? Tuck and Yang have talked about innocence. Gloria Wecker has talked about white innocence. My partner and I in our forthcoming book are talking about psychoanalytic innocence and how psychoanalysis takes that up, especially in the context of Palestine, but in settler colonialism in general. My non-negotiable starting point is an ethical and attuned clinical practice in the settler colonial condition cannot happen without an ideological shift in the theoretical and technical basis of how we function as clinicians. Why this is important is along the lines that Lynne and Marianna sort of map out for us with a social psychoanalysis, that if we don't do that, if we don't work from a consistent interrogation of colonialism and settler colonialism, with a specific emphasis on power relationships, what ends up happening is a sort of regression to the place of innocence that works to dislocate and displace us, as well as the central working pieces of the struggles and challenges folks have, right? So there's a constant pressure to dislocate and dismember and erase folks if we're not constantly reaffirming these non-negotiable truths. What's specifically the sort of working tenets within us is that if we're not working constantly from a place of anti-oppression within the context of these oppressive systems, our work, our clinical work and our theorizing and our teaching and our training will refocus on the individual encounter. And that individual encounter is not just sort of like, I'm locating this within the intrapsychic, which is one of our many problems, but also that the individual encounter by default falls on fault lines that works in service of capitalism, right? And most simply, capitalism, profit over people, right? That we will always locate profit over people. And neoliberal subjectivity, as Lynne has already said. And how I might think about that is that there's this sort of myth that you are an agent, you have your own individual sort of ideas, you can choose within the confines of the free market, of course, right? So usually meaning subjectivity itself is linked into the free market, but it's sold as surprise free, right? Like you have all the options in the world within this, but what we know about that is it's already foreclosed possibilities of being, right? By virtue of being in relationship to that. And it serves, it's in service of an imperial power, right? It will shore up systems of power, including the centrality of the United States as an imperial power in the world. We see this right now. Joe Biden has bombed Syria, created a new holding space for children on the borders, and deported 30,000 people before anybody gets a stimulus check, right? The United States is an imperial power, period. And I think it's important for us to think about how us within a structure of power like psychoanalysis, how we become imperious too. How do we interject the sort of imperialism of the United States as a functioning mechanics of the work that we do, and that's our profession is imperious. It also locates the problem within the individual to displace specifically socio-political history and reality, right? Indigenous scholars like Gone and Braveheart Yellowhorse would call this they focus on point in time traumas rather than racial traumas, right? With this idea being that this is a historical trauma. There's no way that temporality can sort of be enough to hold that. And then what I had said is it works on foreclosed possibilities, right? Especially with regard to health and wellness, how we conceive of ability and debility, even our ideas about what makes healthy individuals, which will always go, again, in service of capitalism, service of neoliberalism. Let's patch up people and make them be able to attend to being sort of subjects that can recreate sort of a new liberal subjectivity, be productive, sort of tamper down symptoms that actually for us should be central, right? We should be celebrating symptoms when we lived in a fundamentally fucked up society, right? Fundamentally violent society, that maybe there's a place where we should be like, symptoms are actually healthy. Like, yeah, I would be surprised and kind of worried if you didn't have symptoms when you live within these structures. And then, of course, the larger thing that we do very well in psychoanalysis is that we disavow the complicity we have in what Lynne says, other people's suffering, right? Everything happens out there versus fundamentally thinking of ourselves as agents of the state, as Fanon would tell us. How are we implicated very actively in people's suffering under the guise of innocence, right? None of us come into this field, hopefully there's some sadists out there, but most of us don't come into the field wanting to be actively sadistic. But that does not mean that we don't engage in violence against folks. And if we're not working from an anti-oppressive framework, and I am very specific about how that's a split, you either work from an anti-oppressive framework or you don't. There's no in between. Right? And folks who have been marginalized for ages know that it's visceral. It can be felt on a visceral level when we're working from an anti-oppressive model or when we're not. The last thing I'll say before we open it up is that this split is ideologically based, right? What again, this concept of psychoanalytic innocence, it's baked into our theories, right? To have this out, to be able to have an out and claim innocence. And I'm saying this ideological versus contrast of lack of knowledge, right? A lot of folks oftentimes will say, well, what do you want us to do, right? I'll be in like, well, tell us what to do. And I think that's a bad faith question, because all of us in this room have been in spaces where marginalized folks have told you exactly what to do, right? The fact that we have not taken up these issues tells us something else is happening, right? And there's something about the ideological framework of our practice that would lend itself to replicating these systems rather than ameliorate them, right? That is ideological. Our position is ideological. And again, we have so much to learn from Black scholars, from Indigenous scholars, from folks of color in general, and globally, not just in the United States. I will end there and we'll turn it over. Marianna, you want to go?
Sure. All right. Thank you, Lara. So we are going to open it up now for a discussion. We're going to start by looking at the Padlet, which I just looked at, and it looks like somebody posted there asking for the Zoom link. So if Lara or Lynn, if one of you can just jump in and post that there, that would be good. I just spotted that. So yeah, we're gonna open it up. Thank you to folks who took the time to think of questions in advance and post them here. Thanks to Jessica Chavez again for organizing that. So I'll read those questions in the order that they were submitted, but please also feel free to raise your hand, either using, it should show up either in the 3 dots if you toggle over the right top corner of your window, or in your reactions tab at the bottom of the screen. So feel free to raise your hand and I'll keep track of who's raising their hands. Also feel free to post questions in the chat and I'll do my best to make sure we get to as many questions as we can. So we'll take about 40 minutes or so for this part. And then Carter, who's our president of Section 9, will jump in our last 15 minutes to talk about next steps, sort of what spaces can we continue to generate as a group within Section 9 and expanding outwards for this conversation to continue. Where's the forward momentum that the group is feeling, and what are people hungry for? And so Carter's going to step in at the end for that. Thank you, Carter, in advance.
And then Marianna, can you just relocate us also to there are folks who came in afterwards about how we'd like to platform folks.
Yeah, so we would like this to be a space where people whose voices are not typically heard have the space to share their questions. And so we're going to ask, if you're someone whose voice is often heard either in group settings like this or in your own writing and publication, please hold your questions for the time being. We really like to make space for BIPOC participants, graduate students, again, people whose voices are not often heard in these spaces, to share their questions and their comments. So we'd like to prioritize that here, and we will be attending to sort of power dynamics as they unfold in the discussion as well.
Can I also suggest, I'm not sure this is something we talked about before, but as another way of decentering power, that other people can respond to these questions too, not just the 3 of us.
Yes.
So please jump in if you have thoughts, because some of these questions you'll probably have more interesting thoughts than I do. So please do. Yes,
we very much want this to be a horizontal discussion and not the kind of top down that you typically see. This is something Lynn and I have been thinking a lot about, was what does social psychoanalysis look like in a group setting like this? And so moving away from the hierarchical, panelist format is important here. So I'll read the questions as they were received in the Padlet. They were all anonymously submitted. If you are somebody who submitted it, please feel free to identify yourselves if you'd like. That's up to you. And I will try to speak more slowly. I apologize that I spoke so quickly. Thank you, Jody, for letting me know that. I will try to read these questions more slowly so that folks can take them in. They're really thoughtful, and we really appreciate the time people took to submit them. So let's see, going back, let's see, maybe open up my screen a little bit more here. Looks like, okay, so I'll start with the community. Here it is. Question was submitted a couple of weeks ago. In analytic institutes, historically elite white institutions in which a fundamentally race-blind relational technique is taught, is anti-racism even possible? Do new institutes and programs need to be developed? I will also copy the link to the Padlet into the chat so that anybody who wants to read along, please feel free.
I would love to speak to that because yesterday I mentioned that we had an amazing program at my institute, MIP, Massachusetts Institute for Psychoanalysis, with Michelle Stevens, who basically was presenting a Black feminist perspective interwoven with relational theory, particularly Bromberg's ideas about dissociation and me and not me, and particularly Toni Morrison work from Playing in the Dark. About how we can have engagements that will allow, where white people do not dissociate their whiteness in the encounter. And so the immediate wish was for her to come and teach a course or start a whole curriculum, because I think the answer to the question that the person posed is no. A colorblind, I'm sorry to use the disability word blind, color ignorant, color evasive stance is just going to reproduce. We will be having a normative unconscious institutional enactment where we continue to reproduce the dominant, the folks who are already in charge. We'll just keep going on being in charge. So I think curricular change is incredibly important. And I thought Michelle pointed the way towards one of the ways towards doing that. I always have felt like engaging with work outside our field, I said that earlier, is just so important because I think we do have some wonderful concepts. And as I said, the whole idea that the relational idea that two unconsciouses are in the room was an incredible advance, I think, on theories that posited that only the patient had an unconscious and the therapist was just giving out good shit, and the patient was refusing to take in that good shit. Really problematic theories, and they continue. I mean, there's still people out here talking about how we can leave ourselves at the door. The analyst leaves themselves at the door, has no ego investments, and just listens. To me, this is really actually incredible bullshit. So that's my comment on that question.
Lara, would you like to jump in?
Of course I do.
I thought you might have something to say.
As a resounding no, but let me say why. And I mean, it's along the same lines that Lynne is saying. And here's I think the problem. I think that it's really easy for us to sort of imagine anti-racism, and we can see how movements like this become defanged very quickly, right? Where anti-racism becomes, of course, a worthwhile goal. None of us are going to say, oh, no, let's not be anti-racist, right? But there's a comfort in defanging and depoliticizing what that means. So we start to see a co-optation of what that means within the spaces. Nothing changes in the structure. Nothing changes in terms of how processes flow. Nothing changes in terms of policies and procedures. And yet we're able to say we're an anti-racist institution. Right. And so I think that for me, anti-racism cannot exist if we're not also saying anti-racism is anti-imperialism, is anti-capitalism, is pro-indigenous and pro-indigeneity, right? And to my knowledge, not one of our spaces has held that position yet. And so what does anti-racism mean if it just replicates, let me fill in, right, a sort of empty, what Black feminists would tell us is an empty, depoliticized identity politics, right? Let's go back to Combahee River collective identity politics, not this bastardized version of it now that we have, right? It's not about filling bodies, right? of Black, brown, indigenous bodies into certain spaces and seating nothing structurally. Why? Because when we work like that, it's still always imagined by the white settler gaze, right? What is it that will satisfy my ideas about what anti-racism looks like? And we see this over and over again. We have institutes that are sort of working very hard at this. And then who gets disciplined within these spaces, whose voices are heard, whose voices are even welcome into it. If you have somebody that's slightly outside the framework of what's imagined even, right? So there are particular Black bodies that are allowed in there. There are particular brown bodies that are allowed in there. In my context, there's always a push about the good Arab and the bad Arab, right? And I've literally had people say to me, this is what we think a good Arab is, and this is what we think a bad Arab is, right? And the only way that that happens is when those of us from marginalized spaces are co-opted into a larger settler, colonial, and racist model of being and compromise that fits a particular type of gaze that in the end is structured around futurity of that model. And that's why right now, I don't think we have anything that looks like it's anti-racist, right? And the commitment to that, the commitment to this space of, again, anti-racist, anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist as part of anti-racism has to be first, which means we rethink training altogether, which means we rethink psychoanalysis altogether. Mayang, did you want to say something?
I did. Thank you for noticing me putting myself on off mute. I wanted to jump in, if I may, and I'm gonna, really appreciate and take up all of you kind of opening space up for, parallel kind of horizontal conversation. My name's Mayang. I am speaking today from San Francisco, out here on the West Coast, and I wanted to share this story, if I may, really related to this question that's been brought up that happened to me about a year ago. So I consider myself an early career psychologist and psychodynamically, psychoanalytically oriented, but have really been very hesitant as an Asian American, as an immigrant, to really kind of lean into analytic training the way that a lot of my peers have talked about or started to engage with. And because of, some of these concerns that we're talking about, of going into spaces that do more harm often, that there's such a high cost, both monetarily, but also really psychically and spiritually, being who I am and being in the skin that I am, to sort of, in order to gain this level of recognition or knowledge or whatnot, that there's such a high level of cost that has to be paid. And so the story that I wanted to share was, but at the same time, again, being kind of where I am in my career, and I've really wanted to get closer. I've really kind of yearned for knowledge and learning and mentorship, in this field, and wanting to get closer. Because I see so much potential in it, and I feel into it in a way that I don't feel about other parts of our field. So I think in an attempt at that, about a year ago, I was applying to a one-year program at an institute that I will not name, not for the protection of the institution, but really to say that I think what I experienced was not unusual, and I want to say that so by not naming it, maybe there's a way to imagine and to think about how the institutes that are in all of our local communities that we know about. I think these things happen. It's not about this one institute, but I think it could have happened anywhere. So I was applying to this one-year program that actually had a very explicit focus on socio-political issues, especially in light of, the renewed Black Lives Matter protests in the spring. And so I think they kind of pivoted or wanted to shift their program into this new focus. And it was, unlike anything that I had seen, and it felt promising in a lot of ways. So I applied and got all the way through, interviews, application, got accepted. But I was, again, I felt like if I wanted to spend a year learning and really opening myself up in a really vulnerable way to this program, I really needed to make sure that this was, you know, an actively anti-oppressive, anti-racist space. So I started just asking some questions about, you know, how they were thinking, how they were recruiting, you know, students of color, how they were thinking about, you know, supporting students of color to go through a program like this, and whether they had, you know, other BIPOC students who've had similar experiences that I could speak with. So what I felt like were not really earth-shattering questions, but what I encountered almost immediately was such a level of defensiveness. And I mean, it was really, you know, it was astonishing, but not surprising. And in a way that really, and this is the thing that I've encountered, I think, in psychoanalysis, particularly over and over, that there's a way in which the theory becomes a weapon. And that's what kind of happened in this incident too, that, you know, it became about my anxiety, you know, my inability to tolerate uncertainty, that suggested, you know, that, so that's kind of what happened. And I, you know, fortunately, I think I was able to see that fairly clearly. You know, and I was told that perhaps it would be good for me to wait a year, to defer, and come back, as someone else interpreted for me as that I was walked to the door. So I, you know, I mean, I want to share that story, I think, one, to, you know, I mean, give, I think, a personal witnessing to this question that's been raised, and I see that it's, you know, been in there a couple of times, and to, you know, and I think both to kind of highlight the urgency of what's being, you know, of this question of training and re-envisioning our institutions and how they're treating these issues, but also, you know, saying that again, I'm not alone out here, you know, as early career, as students, that this really needed to happen like yesterday, that there's so many of us that are kind of outside of the walls, you know, just waiting and wanting to come in and be a part of, you know, I think this really, what I think could be a really vibrant community. Yeah, so, you know, so I think I'm trying also to think about, I'm starting to get into teaching and trying to think about how to open these doors, but I think I just wanted to put a call out there. You know, so glad that we're having this conversation, and particularly for people who are in the position of mentoring, gatekeeping, teaching, that, like Lara said, you know, that if this is not an active part of what's being done, that it's not, you know, that the opposite is happening. Thank you.
One of the amazing things you're saying to me is that, number one, there's a sort of, if you're not actively doing that as institutions, stop claiming that you are, right? Like, own the fact that you're not. And, you know, if we're in the business of the working through, why not say we're working through and be honest? At least then we have goalposts for those of us who are coming in, rather than sort of coming into it expecting something, then having the bait and switch, like you're saying, happened. The other piece of it that's really hitting hard for me, and I so appreciate you putting a personal face to it and a personal narrative to it, is that by the time we're in that space, we've already done so much self-effacement, so much preparatory work, so much research, so much, right? So much legwork that goes into this to be even come there. And we're either received as free of interiority, you're just anxious and you haven't thought this through, or the aggressive part of like, you have no idea how much this has been filtered through to get to this point, right? And so you're always in this process of self-effacement and compromise, and negotiating power and negotiating our own guilt around engaging in systems that fundamentally ask us to compromise ourselves, right? And what that means in terms of our community. What does it mean? I think all of us can sort of conjure up our community even asking us, why are you in these spaces, right? And what does that mean in terms of community and kinship, when we're sort of we're joining, actively joining spaces that have a historically, right, disenfranchised, that has historically caused violence on our people too, right? Chapter.
Yeah, I'll just briefly add that I think what psychoanalytic institutes, including the ones that are working on anti-racism and putting out programs like the one you spoke about, you know, the humility that Lara is talking about, I think is really important. And they're right now, they're not safe spaces. They are, you know, as a student in another program that I'm working in said, they're spaces, and actually in a paper that was written recently by an African-American woman, a Latino woman, and a Jewish woman, the paper on the secret society, I think we mentioned it last time. They talk about the Shanda, the African-American woman, talks about how she almost wished race wouldn't be brought up in the program and that she could just sort of slide by without, you know, having her race taken up. But I think, you know, people, and I'm so excited about this. People are now saying, no, I'm not going to go into a program where I can't bring my full self. And if psychoanalytic institutes aren't able to hear that, they're screwed, basically, in my opinion. It's going to be, it's the end of a field that does have stuff to offer, as you said.
I want to invite Mamta message me separately to share some thoughts about structural change, and then we can move back over to the Padlet or invite more questions from.
There's another hand up, Marianna.
Oh, okay, thank you. So Mamta, do you want to go ahead?
Sure. Hi, we're hanging out here saying hello.
Hi.
So I really appreciate this conversation. I think that, you know, there's always this question of how do we make analytic institutes more inclusive and the problems that you all have been talking about. And then I've also noticed in my communities, there's like an effort to create an alternate space, right? Alternate analytic space where we come together. And my observation has been that when we do that, we also reproduce the same dynamics. And so I'm curious about what we think, how do you all think about these spaces that can sort of hold analytic thinking in them, but aren't necessarily, like, how do we not reproduce, right? How do we not just create the same structure outside? And, you know, I've been thinking a lot about indigeneity and things like that, but I'm just very curious to hear about how we integrate psychoanalysis into different ways of being in community or relating, or how you all just imagine up that space and what we kind of need to do to imagine up something a little bit different. Yeah, so that's my question. Love to hear from you all.
Thank you. Can I invite Gagan? I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Can I invite you to comment?
Yeah. I'm Gagan. Hi, everyone. I am talking from New Delhi, India, and I'm a trainee psychoanalytic psychotherapist. And I really appreciate, I just want to thank all of you for this conversation. It's really something that has been on my mind from before I actually started training as a therapist, because psychoanalysis has always been the space that speaks to so much socially, politically, you know, and in my country, in a space like my country, mental health is a very complex and may I say lawless field. Regulations like you have in the States, in Canada, or maybe, you know, most of Europe, they're not in place as of yet, and yet here we are training in psychoanalysis. We're learning about how to do psychoanalysis without really, you know, having an idea of what it means to be in India in the 2000s, 2020, etc., and connect all that we learn in theory to what we experience day in, day out, living in the social structure. And I was, you know, the one thing that I really have observed in my institution actually is that there's how do I put this? You know how Hegel writes about the master-slave dialectic, and there's just this cyclical loop that even when you break free of it, the internalized master-slave thing doesn't really go away, and it just keeps continuing. And if you can imagine that in a you know, trainer trainee sort of a situation where even really senior and experienced psychoanalysts who are training us, who are teaching us, are also playing catch up to the West. So the focus is so far away from what we face in the clinic, from what we deal with in the clinic, that even though I feel like I'm equipped with the tools that theory has provided me, that my training, supervisions, etc. has provided me with, in the clinic, I often find myself at a loss. I feel really torn between this analyst's idea that's been given to me and this person, this human, this experienced, you know, experience of life that I've had growing up in India, you know, observing. India is also, so there's racism and there's something called casteism, and I don't know how many of you would know about that, but the caste system is abhorrent. It's horrifying. There's just, it's pervasive. Like I could go on about that. And another thing that I would just really want to say is that accessibility, we suffer, us students, we suffer so much because if I were to be honest, if this was happening in a physical space, if you all were meeting, it would cost me over like 1 million rupees to travel to where you all are and be able to attend a webinar. And that is really frustrating. And I'm just really grateful that this has been so accessible. And yeah, that's all. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to see if there are folks who want to respond, stay in this theme. We can stay here. We can also move over to the Padlet.
Can I just say one thing really quick?
Sure, Vanessa.
Just this last point, I think is so important. Now that we do have digital spaces, we can make psychoanalytic formation or training more accessible to more people, more areas, and maybe we can think about that in relation to like a new way of doing psychoanalytic formation that's not so institutional.
That's really important, and I think we don't have an excuse anymore, right? I mean, many of us who are binational, many of us who have families abroad have always sort of fought for this idea, you know, that and those of us who don't believe in borders, of course, right, have said, what is this sort of arbitrary setting up of borders, which by essence creates exclusivity and who's outside of it, right? And I think that's, Gagan, that's part of what you're saying, is who do we even think about as belonging in these spaces? Who do we imagine? And by virtue of these things happening in some spaces and not others, we're by default creating spaces where psychoanalysis exists and other spaces where they don't, right? Communities psychoanalysis is one way that we do that as well. Psychoanalysis exists only in institutes or only in certain spaces, not in the community. That's not psychoanalysis. The many things that we have heard over and over again. I think I find some first of all, by the way, solidarity with my siblings in the street for the farmers protest. And that will always be where our solidarity lies. But I also want to say this gets into Mamta's point about recreating, right, issues. And for me, I think that's not surprising to me because white supremacy is the issue. We are not the issue. Black, brown, indigenous bodies, queer bodies are not the issue, right? Ableism is the issue. If we come back to these structures, then we're not surprised when these things get recreated. To me, that's where a liberation theory or sort of decolonial theory really helps, right? Because it's an active political process. And again, an emphasis on political. It's not, there is a political process of forging spaces of livability. Nadira Shalhoub-Tavorkian, who's a Palestinian clinician, talks about how does one forge spaces of livability under extreme oppression and ongoing oppression, right? And the ways we do that when we recreate our spaces, if we're always doing it with a claim to legitimacy in terms of white supremacy, if we're always doing it with a sort of comparison and relationality, and when I say relationality, I'm not talking about relativity, right? I'm saying if we're always reimagining our spaces as being constructs that shore up white supremacy, we will fall back into these issues. If we forget that these things are political and political at their core, then we forget that part of the process is a constant renegotiation of our positionality in relationship to power, about the means of power, who holds power, how that replicates itself, and then of course about knowledge production, right? That decolonial process in one way teaches us that we need to constantly be unlearning and relearning and decentering, right? Because there's no way that when we function within normative spaces, so when I see these things show up in our spaces, Mamta, it's because we're, sort of relying on normative standards even unconsciously to recreate our own spaces. And what decolonial theory would teach us is reconstructing that normativity helps us sort of move away and recenter. Mamta won't toot her own horn, but she has an amazing paper in the special issue of Gender Studies in Gender and Sexuality, talking about decolonizing psychoanalysis using queer theory. And I think that's a start, is how do we refuse to be silenced and say, actually, no, this is the way we decenter, and showing up in these spaces, but showing up in the ways, and this is to your point, Lynne, is that you were saying that people are refusing not to show up in their whole selves, right? And I found myself kind of recoiling at that. And then I realized why, because that can be interpreted as an empty individualism. I don't think you were saying that. I'm saying there's an indulgent individualism that sometimes can be sold, neoliberalism, like you just need to show up as your whole self. Whereas I think it's like we show up with our whole community, with our ancestry, with our ancestral knowledge, right? And that's the place of that. And these spaces deny us that access to history. That's how we get dislocated. We get dislocated and dismembered because it's asking us to leave our history and our ancestry behind.
Yeah, I just want to jump in there because I think it was actually in one of Sue Grand's papers. She said a patient posed to her the question, does psychoanalysis have any way of speaking to the collective self? And I think that's really a central issue that psychoanalysis needs to take up. And I wanted to also jump in on what Mamta said too, because I think that part of what I hear when you say that is a kind of a, quite common psychological struggle, that part of the unconscious that resists and the part of the unconscious that conforms, that people are, even the most radical among us, I think, are longing for recognition from those who have power. And that becomes really sadly enacted in all kinds of different ways that make it hard to set up an alternative institution. But I think alternative institutions are possibly the way to go.
Thank you, Lynne. Thank you, Gagan and Mamta and Mayang for contributing so far. I'm mindful of our time and the richness of what is coming up here, and thinking about this question of reimagining spaces, and my hope that part of the conversation that we're going to start, that Carter's going to introduce very, very soon, is about, I think is very much about that. And this in and of itself, I think, warrants more discussion. But how do we create more spaces that are outside of the imagination that has been so colonized by white supremacy and capitalism? How do we create those spaces among ourselves in ways that are truly, truly accessible? And Yuli, thank you for your point here. As a high school student, it's true, you never would have been able to join. I believe that, and I'm very grateful that you're here. So with another few minutes remaining in this portion of our meeting, a theme that has been coming up, I think, in these comments so far is addressed in one of the comments that was posted on the Padlet. And again, I'm just going from what was posted first and coming up to most recently. And so this question is about community. The writer, again, feel free to identify yourself if you'd like, it's posted anonymously. says, we use the term community in many ways that are inherited from other discourses. I believe that psychoanalysis has failed or only begun to develop a recognition of the impact of community on unconscious experience and practices that could impact the positive effects of community for those participating in such a process. Community is too often used as a place space rather than an ongoing process in which struggle is required for growth and nurturance. Do you agree or disagree? Would you add more or change this view? And if so, would you share more of your own thinking?
That was my question.
Oh, that was you, Steve. Okay, thank you. So I'd like to open that up, to Lynne and Lara, of course, and to the group. What is this question? I especially appreciate the temporal aspect of community that's evoked by this, as well as I think the potential for a neoliberal mainstreaming of community, which I think we see all too often in a way that it gets weaponized. And so I'd like to hear from the group. What thoughts emerge here?
I'm happy to associate to it while people are waiting. But what I associated to from that question, and it's kind of connected to what I was saying before about the psychoanalysis have a way of speaking to the collective parts of ourselves. It actually takes me back to the first book that I wrote, which is on gender. I was arguing against post-structuralists that were pretty much seeing any kind of identity category as oppressive, that some ways of re-articulating identities can be actually quite progressive, and feminism was one such, and that was a community that was very important community for me. So, it may not be the exact thought that you're having about community, but that's what I associated to. That certainly communities are facilitative and can be subjecting as well, repressive as well. And it's negotiating those two aspects of it, I think, that are push us further.
Yeah, I also think that there's something to be said, like for me as an Arab born and raised in the Arab world, community, I have a different relationship to community that's not in service of the individual, right? It's not a new concept. And I think this is something for us psychoanalysis that consistently does, is like, there is no reinventing what community means. Solidarity is forged by struggle. Fanon taught us that, right? And solidarity is different than community, can be different than community, right? We're not all in solidarity when we're in community. And sometimes I think this is to your point, Lynne, is that communities within the framework of psychoanalysis right now, there's also, when you ask people to join a community, you're also asking sometimes for a loyalty oath, right? And that's what happens when those of us who are marginalized speak out within the community and say, hold up, this imaginary community that you have structured that has these boundaries, it's not community in the way that you imagine it. And those are the bodies that get disciplined. Those are the people that get disciplined the most. And that's telling on itself. We're telling on ourselves about what we mean by community, right? And allegiance to that. What I would say is that we have so much to learn from the global South around this, right? My comrades in Palestine who have been thinking through this issue about community as they are actively being oppressed and dismembered constantly across the divide of an apartheid state, they still forge community. Community was never lost for them, whether it's in the diaspora or on the ground in historic Palestine. Folks in South Africa, even throughout apartheid, who consistently created community through solidarity and struggle. Folks in the global South, in India, as we just heard, I'm also in close contact with folks in India and in partitioned, right, post-colonial India and Pakistan. And of course, I can't help but also think about the Middle East in general, that over my lifetime has been utterly decimated by imperialism, and how we continue to forge community despite that, whether in diaspora or not. So I don't think there's a split between these things. And I think that's why the social psychoanalysis is so important, because when we're thinking about these processes as occurring already, and that we're not reinventing anything, that maybe we're just humbling ourselves to say, hey, we have to so much to learn from folks who are already doing this, then we're in a better position to sort of struggle through, right? Community is not organic, you struggle through. And that's, I think what I was saying, like we struggle, Marianna, Lynne, and myself struggle through being in these spaces together in community and forging solidarity. That's not a bad thing. That's how it's done. You know, I think Nian had her hand up.
Sure, yeah, thank you, Lara. I wanted to just echo a little bit of my thoughts with regards to community. I think I like to think of what's happening in the treatment room and that mirroring our ideal of wanting to move away from the oppressive psychoanalytic systems that are present. But my experience in analysis as a Palestinian woman, my analyst was a white male, and some of the things that I felt caused a barrier between us, although my analysis was impactful and helpful. There were times when I would, of course, talk about wanting to go back to the Middle East and longing for, you know, to be around my people. And rather than my analyst kind of acknowledging that, it became more of interpretation of you're escaping your current reality. You know, you're wanting to escape what's happening right now rather than acknowledging kind of your reality in the present moment. So I felt that whenever my culture was brought in, he didn't know what to do with it. And so then it was interpreted as being an internal conflict rather than acknowledging the reality of, no, I feel out of place here in the United States. And I do want to go back. You know, I do feel better back in the Middle East, but I felt that he, and, you know, I don't want to in any way criticize him or anything like that, but I do feel like he didn't know what to do with it. And me having gone through analytic training myself, felt that analysts don't know what to do with that material. And so they stick to what they know. And of course it's limited. And so I think that's part of it as well. So with regards to community, it just made me think, I was gonna say, rather than kind of stressing the autonomy of the individual to be able to heal themselves through analysis, but rather working to utilize the community as well and putting this patient or helping our patients to turn back, lean on their communities as well. Mm-hmm.
Leanne, you know, I think that what you're saying just so much connects with what I started with about social locations. I would imagine your analyst had never thought about himself as having a social location. And that's really problematic. So that's, you know, as I said, each time I have these conversations, it becomes clearer and clearer to me how important it is to reflect on your various social locations and how they do and do not interact with those of others. Rather than taking yourself as the, you know, the subject of history, the autonomous blank subject of history.
Thank you, Leanne. And Lynne, I'm feeling the energy and the movement within the group around what's being raised, and both in what was posted and what's arising here in the chat and in the group, and want to flag for folks who may not have it on their calendars yet that the Division 39 conference is coming up. And what I would love would be for these kinds of questions and this kind of space to be evoked throughout, and I know that is in every way the intent of the organizers of that conference. And I think that we have a space now and the power and the capacity to really transform what this conference looks like and what is deemed psychoanalytic. And my hope is that as participants and speakers, that we can really transform that particular space. And I know that has been the intent throughout by the organizers. So I think Lara, if you want to drop into the chat the link to the conference for anybody who doesn't have it yet. And now I'd like to kick it over to Carter, because I think this is clearly really essential that we be thinking as a group about what are the spaces, what does community look like among those of us who want to reimagine these spaces, and how can we engage collectively. So, you know, in 10 minutes, 11 minutes, we could at least initiate that conversation. And this is in so many ways, I think, a conversation that is going to continue to grow, and I hope it go in many directions. So
Right.
Carter, feel free to jump in.
To quote Busta Rhymes, let's go.
Let's do this.
So excited. I have so many thoughts. I want to talk to you all forever. This is a space that we can make whatever we want, really. I mean, the Section 9 as an organization, like, we want to be one of the things. We want to be serve the purpose in whatever way that we can, right? And like, you know, we're a part of APA, we're a part of Division 39. We're like not an uncolonized institution by any stretch of the imagination. Maybe that's the thing we need to build, and maybe this can be part of where we, you know, strategize and plot and figure out how to do that. But like, I hope that what we can do for this emergent community is like be an undercommons, or we can figure out how to like fuck shit up. And also be a space where we can, like, you know, borrow whatever kind of privilege and symbolic capital derives from this institution to, like, you know, stunt on other people and make our thing. So without further ado, what do you want to need from us? Like, how would you, like, you know, you can say it in the chat, you can say it anywhere you want, but like, I'm just taking notes about what would be of use to you and to us as we like take this forward.
And I just want to say, with the understanding that in addition to showing up at Division 39 and forcing people to have these conversations, that we anticipate this being an ongoing conversation, right? So I think your question, Carter, is important because this doesn't end here, which is always what we run into, right? There's like 2 hours to talk about this. And those of us are like, how does this even, it's an ongoing process, right?
You remember that thing from Hamilton, this is not a moment, it's a movement?
Really, Carter? Hamilton?
It's a good line. Nobody's perfect. The unconscious is real, but it is. But y'all know. Okay, y'all know. Help me out here. What do you want?
Hi there. I'm not going to turn on my video. I'm running some errands today, but I did want to just kind of return to what Mamta was saying, and Carter, your question a little bit about alternative spaces. And so hi everyone, my name is Courtney. You can also call me Coco. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm in Vermont, unceded Abenaki land. And so a big part of, you know, my work as a budding psychotherapist, as a graduate student, and as a community member, I'm in a rural area. And so, you know, being a provider in a rural area, alternative spaces is really the future right now in terms of mental health care and services for ordinary people, because our agencies and our organizations have continuously failed our Black and Brown communities, and also harmed our Black and Brown clinicians. So I think as a community, we are really seeing a strong pull away from traditional spaces, and a greater investment, not only emotionally, but monetarily as well, in alternative spaces. So as we do move to this, you know, new model in some ways, is there a way that we can have spaces where clinicians and psychoanalysts and people that are interested in theory can get together to talk about how we build these spaces, rather than, you know, what are the puddles that we're going to fall into? What are the mistakes we're going to make? Rather than taking this approach of like, you know, how can we not do something? How can we just start to embrace that we're going to step in it, and really have continuous dialogue around what to do, if that makes sense.
This would probably be the moment too where people who are involved with reflective spaces and material spaces in the collaboratory would want me to put in a plug as people who are like doing, I think, a version of what you're talking about, but like, you know, we need to do it whenever we can. Is that Hattie? Is that a hand raised?
I want to put in a plug. Is that okay, Lara? Okay. I just want to tell you all about this space. That's really, that I would so encourage you all to join in. I'm chief editor and founder of this place called Room, a sketchbook for analytic action. which some of you may have heard of because I've been trying to, it's been getting bigger, and we started it right after Trump was elected. Lara has a beautiful essay in the last issue, Lara, or the one before, I'm not sure. And some of you, I can recognize names of people I've seen, but I would strongly encourage you, I'll put it in the chat. You can check out the website. It's a very analytic space. It's a space where we don't have themes. We just want people to submit whatever you would like to. It's interdisciplinary. It's very political. It's about analytic action and creating a space, a very virtual space, although now we're in print as well, in the community. And it's, it's not just American, it's international. It's not just, I'm a training analyst at IPTAR, and I'm part of APSA, I'm part of IPTAR. It is not just that. It's people who are not from institutes. It's people who are relational. It's people who are Bionian, Kleinian, nothing, and it's everything. But it's really analytic, and it's really kind of trying to open up exactly what we're talking about in this room to people who aren't even in the mental health profession, and which is it's been very vibrant. Anyway, that's my spiel, but I really would encourage you to join us and really use this virtual space that we've created, because there is a certain level of power in it to have that kind of access to a multimodal position, really moving into a virtual world that hits many more people. So, Lara, you can say more.
I would encourage you. I'll drop the link too.
Thank you.
Mamta, were you going to jump too?
Hi, yeah, Mamta again. So I was just thinking about this question of space, right? And then Lara's bid for us to think about like liberation theory, and just noticing, right, the desire that's reproduced to have a special space, right? A space that we can go to, a place. And then I think about land and land back movements, and then how we come to understand space and what space means to us in a physical space. I was recently listening while taking care of my little one to Braiding Sweetgrass. And in there, she talks about how in her indigenous language, there's like many, many, many more verbs than there are nouns compared to English, and how you are like the verb, a bay is not a noun. The verb is to be a bay and to be a river. And it's such an interesting shift in terms of what is alive and what is animated. And I'm just inviting us to think a little bit when we have, in lieu of what Coco was also saying, right? Like, how do we catch that we're going to do this? I see that already in our bid for space, right? Wanting to have a virtual space even, right? And how do we think about what space means, what it means to be a bay, what it means to, be alive and be a bay as opposed to a bay being a static thing. What is space if we think about it as static versus like moving and created and in flux in a sort of decentered way. So just wanted to share that reflection.
I think so much in your point is like picking up, I'm hearing that a lot in this conversation, and it occurs to me that like one of the experiences of racism that I know a number of us here have been through in psychoanalysis is that like we found the environment inhospitable, so we became friends with each other and like we're homies and found ways to do work together and lift each other up and like navigate the systems. And then the instant that we got any level of success in doing that, a kind of white power structure in psychoanalysis was like, oh, well, you're all friends with each other and this is an in-group and this is groupthink and we can't have that. And I'm like, girl, do you not think it was groupthink before? Like, you're all friends. That was the point. You've been doing this. But like, they don't see it that way when it's like the return of their repressed. I think it's fucking radical that we can hang out here. And that I want to just like let that, like almost maybe without even like articulating a further intention, like clearly this is a group of people that care about these ways of thinking and these ways of like being and doing stuff in the world. And like a lesson that I'm taking for section 9 as we go forward is like, it seems like y'all would really like it if we just had more spaces to talk and like undercommons the house down and just like keep going from there. Yeah. Man, we're gonna jump into.
Yes, if I may.
Oh, please.
Along these lines of space, I mean, I've been thinking about this. I'm going to put out a request for a space for BIPOC folks specifically, and I want to say that not. I was just writing some of my thoughts down. Like, to me, having kind of BIPOC only spaces are not a repudiation. It's not enough. I don't want to say that this is it's not the solution. But I do think, Carter, what you were saying about, that we're friends and, like we find each other and we kind of form this community, but it's always in this, it's not recognized. It's not recognized. Often it's punished, as like, this is not something that should happen. And I would love to see a way in which a space not only sort of allows, but really celebrates that, and sees that as a modality of, just an explicit recognition that it's different being BIPOC. And I use kind of race as I think it's race and racism has a particular kind of salience here, but I think it can apply to other dimensions of marginalization. But to have a space that explicitly recognizes that this is important for BIPOC communities to be together with each other, without white folks, as a place of maybe like refuge and shoring up and strengthening and reclaiming our identity, along with the very real recognition that we live in a white supremacist world, that we leave these spaces and we very much exist still in this world that is not just BIPOC. So I'm just going to put that out there. That's something that I know I have been seeking alongside with conversations with white folks and however, other folks who identify as multiracial, who are really committed to this. But I just want to put a call out there specifically for this, because I think it's an important function in and of itself.
Absolutely. So for my fellow organizers, we're at time here. Should we try to call this to a close here?
Could I just put in a plug before we end for our newsletter, which is The Activist, the Psychoanalytic Activist, which is being reimagined as we speak and is, I think, about to relaunch, but there are many, many older articles that are really wonderful. Lara had curated a whole set of articles on the Nakba a couple of years ago. And yes, and now I will just thank all of you for coming. Thank Jessica and Steve again for organizing this, for education and training. I love the idea of staying in this space together ongoingly, and I hope we can do that.
Can I put in one plug before we all hang up?
Yeah.
As we are organizing, right, y'all came for this event. The logistics of us organizing together as a kind of inchoate community are going to be way easier if we have a way to connect with each other, and Section 9 can provide a way to do that. We have a listserv. Our website has all the contact info for our board of directors, including all of the people that you see here today. That's not like, I don't mean that as a self-serving plug, not the least because we have a mutual aid membership where, like, if you can join us for free with no obligation, and in so doing, you're not supporting necessarily APA if you don't believe in doing that, which a lot of us don't either. So I say that not to be like, you should join our thing, but just to say, functionally, that's a place where we can like conspire. So our new website is something I should have had on deck, and maybe somebody else does.
Wild apricot something?
Yeah.
Yeah. Carter, as you're doing that, can I do one final plug? This is like the tale of plugs. Following Mayang's suggestion, I put it in the chat that Leilani Salvo Crane and I have been working on a space called BIPOC Analysis that's explicitly anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist, anti-Zionist, and anti-racist. If you are interested, please feel free to email me. We're coming up with a mission statement. We imagine this is a non-hierarchical space we're coming up with, but we don't want to be the leaders of it. And we can imagine this space together with the idea that it's also radical politically, right? Again, sort of anti-capitalist, anti-racist, anti-imperialist, and anti-Zionist. so that we can forge those spaces together and work from a common understanding of what we mean by that.
Thanks, y'all.
Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you. We hope to see you soon.